So Gertjan Verhasselt is Associate Professor of Papyrology at the Department of Historical and Geographic Sciences and the Ancient World at the University of Padua, and has held a number of different positions as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, Munich, and Harvard. His research focuses on papyrology, both Greco-Egyptian and Herculanean, Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle and the Peripatetic, and biography and ancient Greek history. But today, Gertjan is here to discuss Cypriot philosopher that admittedly I've never heard of. And I was really excited to follow up with Gertjan on this because it's Clearchus of Soli, or also
hmm
known as Soloi, who made it all the way to Afghanistan in antiquity. So really piqued my interest. So thanks for accepting the invitation.
I'm very happy to attend the podcast.
Thank you so much. So just to start us off with, I mean, who who was this guy Clearchus? I mean, what do
hmm
we know about him biographically, and where do we get this information from on him?
hmm So that really immediately opens up with one of the key gaps in our knowledge of Clearchus. Regrettably, very little is known about the life of Clearchus. The few things that we do know with some degree of certainty is that he came from Soli or Soloi in Cyprus, and that he was a direct pupil of Aristotle, and that puts his activity roughly in the second half of the 4th century BC. And that is essentially that is essentially what we know about him biographically. And even that is debated by some people. The Particularly the identification of which Soli we're talking about, whether we're talking about the Soli of Cyprus or the Soli of Cilicia.
That does raise a really good point because from what I've read, there's pretty much some consensus. There's scholarly consensus that this is the Soli in Cyprus and
Mhm,
not Cilicia. What is that based on? Like, how are historians able to confidently say no, he was from Cyprus?
mhm. So the debate around his hometown, whether it's Soli of Cyprus or Soli of Cilicia, the truth of the matter here is that our main ancient sources may not have known this with certainty themselves either. And the main reason why, or the main argument used by proponents of the Cilicia theory, is that the Greek adjective that ancient writers used to describe Clearchus' origin is solos. And the adjective solos was generally used in reference to Soli in Cilicia, while the adjective solios was generally used to refer to Soli of Cyprus. Now, there are nonetheless some occasional counterexamples to that rule, so it is not a 100% rule, even though there's a clear tendency of ancient authors to use solos for Cilicia and solios for Cyprus. And an additional testimony that is sometimes adduced in this discussion is a text in Plutarch, who cites Clearchus alongside the academic philosopher Crantor and the philosopher Theodorus as men from Soli. And we know, at least for Crantor, that he came from Soli in Cilicia. So Plutarch is presenting them, all three of them, as originating from Cilicia. Now, the key testimony in support of Soli in Cyprus is actually a passage we find in Athenaeus, where Clearchus' work entitled "De Gergithios" is quoted. It's quoted at verbatim and is quoted quite at length. And in that quotation, Clearchus speaks of Cyprus as "quote unquote" our land. He speaks of parhemin, among us, so and so is done. And what especially speaks in favor of the Cypriot soloi for that fragment is that the fragment gives us details on local officials found in Cyprus, more specifically in Salamis. He names a few technical names: the Anaktes, the Anasai, the Gerginoi, the Promalanges, all terms that people outside of Cyprus probably would not know, or at the very least wouldn't know what these functions really were. And I think that's the strongest argument, and that's usually the argument that is emphasized by the proponents of Soli of Cyprus. I think it's a very strong argument in favor of Cyprus.
So Clearchus was known as a peripatetic philosopher,
Mhm.
which, again, admittedly, I've never heard of the peripatetic school. How do you distinguish this from other Hellenistic philosophical schools? What makes something uniquely peripatetic?
Mhm. So the Peripatetic school, or the Peripatos, as it's also called, is essentially the school founded by Aristotle, which was also called the Lyceum, sometimes better known by that name. And Aristotle's school can probably be compared to, let's say, a modern university or college, in the sense that Aristotle gave lectures to his students, and various subjects were treated during these lectures, ranging from biology to logic, moral philosophy, politics, rhetoric, even literary criticism. And the school was founded by Aristotle after he left the school of his own teacher, Plato, which was called the Academy. And in comparison with other Hellenistic schools, such as the Academy, but also the Epicurean school, or the Stoa of Zeno of Citium, is that the Peripatos had a much stronger scientific orientation. And what we further observe among the pupils of Aristotle is that various disciplines tend to get distributed over the various pupils, with specific students specializing in specific fields. And for example, one of his pupils is Eudemus of Rhodes, and he was especially focused on mathematics, while his pupil Theophrastus of Eresus, ultimately his successor as head of the Peripatos, devoted much of his time to botany. And another key characteristic of the Peripatos in comparison with other Hellenistic schools is the fact that the Peripatos essentially had no real dogmas. So that meant that Aristotle's pupils could have widely diverging views, not only diverging from each other, but also deviating from the views of their own teacher, Aristotle. And a good example of that is the view on the soul, for instance. Clearchus, for instance, believed in the immortality and the transmigration of the soul, a very Platonic view on the soul, but his fellow student Dicaiarchus of Sicilian Messana, for instance, he held that the soul, first of all, was not immortal, and second of all, didn't exist at all. So that kind of wide spectrum of how far the pupils could take an argument, or how heavily they could deviate from the person lecturing, is, I think, one of the important differences with regard to other Hellenistic schools.
Was Clearchus, I think you did mention this, but he was a direct pupil of Aristotle. But
Yes.
Plutarch calls him a confidant at one point. Does this imply a closer relationship? I mean, how do we characterize it?
Mhm. Indeed, so several ancient sources confirm that Clearchus was a direct student of Aristotle, so I attended his lectures essentially. And indeed, Plutarch's use of the word synetes, the Greek word synetes, confidant or friend of Aristotle, would suggest some kind of closer relationship. Although I immediately need to add that this is the only passage that attests this. All other sources just call him a mathetes, a student or pupil of Aristotle, and that's the substantive that's used in reference to all pupils of Aristotle. Theophrastus, Dicaiarchus, Eudemus, all these people are classified as mathetes of Aristotle. Now, we do know that Clearchus had Aristotle appear as a character in one of his philosophical dialogues on sleep, much like Plato, for instance, does with his teacher Socrates. But that is probably not a particularly strong argument, since other philosophers tend to do the same thing. So, long answer short, Plutarch's phrasing would imply that, although we have no other sources that confirm that.
Now, Clearchus was a first generation peripatetic. Is there any significance to that? I mean, the reason why I ask that is because Plutarch actually says that Clearchus alienated peripatetic doctrine and that he had a rather negative reputation. So, I mean, how do we reconcile these two things? Him being a first generation peripatetic, who
Hmm.
you would assume espouses the tenets
Hmm.
of that school of philosophy, but at the same time, Plutarch says that he wasn't the greatest, so to speak.
Hmm.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Mhm. So the significance of Clearchus as being a first generation peripatetic is that he directly attended Aristotle's lectures in Athens, and is thus more strongly influenced by Aristotle's philosophy than, for instance, later peripatetics like Satyrus of Calatus or Hermippus of Smyrna, important writers of biographies. And we should probably imagine Aristotle's direct pupils as doing quite a bit of field work for their teacher. And two of Aristotle's big research projects were one, his research on animals, and that involved studying the anatomy of animals, their behavior, their habitats, their reproduction, as well as classifying the various types of animals. And the second big research project was Aristotle's research into the history and organization of the Greek city-states, analyzing for every polis, every Greek polis, its history and its political structure. And Aristotle's direct pupils, they must have been involved at the very least as assistants in these two grand research projects. And that's why it's not surprising to see that Clearchus, for instance, was interested in anatomy and biology as well, or that he commented, for instance, in that Gergithios work on local officials found in Cyprus. That's probably related to that kind of big research project that Aristotle was conducting. Now, as far as Plutarch's statement about Clearchus goes, as alienating or perverting, as he even calls it, peripatetic doctrine or peripatetic views, it's important to emphasize that Plutarch is here primarily talking about it's in his dialogue, his work on the face of the moon, a little dialogue by Plutarch that discusses or presents all sorts of ancient views on what the face of the moon, the sort of pattern that some people can recognize, a sort of face in the moon, that kind of darker parts of the moon, and they try to explain what that is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, it's part of that dialogue that Plutarch says, well, what Clearchus says is a perversion of peripatetic views. And the truth is that Plutarch is probably rhetorically exaggerating here. He's talking about Clearchus' view on the face of the moon. According to Clearchus, the face of the moon is a reflection of the ocean onto the moon. And he says, well, that deviates from Aristotle, in the sense that one of his arguments that he adduces is, well, it's incompatible with some views of Aristotle on celestial bodies. They're supposed to be perfect and supposed to be made of only the fifth element, and it's incompatible with that. And the reason why Plutarch seems to be dismissing Clearchus as alienating peripatetic thought is simply that he disagrees with him, or that he is unable to find anything in Aristotle that's a direct parallel to that. But that is hardly perverting Aristotelian doctrines. As I said before, there were no real dogmas in the Peripatos, and even about such essential topics like the soul. What happens to the soul? Does it die after death? Does it fall apart? Does it transmigrate? Or are we reborn? What really happens to the soul? And Aristotle has his view of matter and form. Soul is form and body is matter. And we observe among the Peripatetics, pupils of the direct pupils of Aristotle, that they have their own vision of that. What Clearchus view, it's a bit closer to what Aristotle would state in his own work De Anima, but still is not at all what Aristotle wrote. And Clearchus, the other pupil, just downright said that the soul didn't exist, and that was not problematic. That was not seen as something problematic. So, in all fairness, my impression is that Plutarch is really nitpicking here a bit. The fact that he cannot really find a good parallel in Aristotle does not really qualify labeling him as a perversion of Aristotelian thought. And in fact, we do have other authors like Athenaeus, or the Jewish author Flavius Josephus, who call Clearchus second to none among the philosophers from the Peripatos, or second to none among Aristotle's students. So, with that judgment on Clearchus, Plutarch seems to be standing alone a bit, and at least is not getting the approval of other authors.
Right, right. You mentioned that the different philosophers had different areas of expertise. Before we talk about what works Clearchus was known for, what was his? I mean, you mentioned botany, mathematics. What would Clearchus be known for?
Clearchus would primarily be known for, or the fields that he was primarily interested in would be moral philosophy, a very large part of the fragments or the texts that discuss Clearchus' views are discuss ethics, moral philosophy. Then there's astronomy. There's his work on, or his interest in aquatic animals, so zoology, and his interest in antiquarianism, especially seen in his interest in proverbs and in riddles.
How many works did Clearchus publish? I mean, you mentioned at the start that his expertise, I mean, it was quite a range of different areas, different genres, I suppose. How many works is he known for?
So the exact number of Clearchus' work is actually a hard question to answer with certainty. And the reason for that is that unlike other philosophers, unlike for instance Aristotle or Theophrastus or Epicurus or Chrysippus, there are no ancient lists of Clearchus' works. For Aristotle, for instance, all his biographies or many of his biographies close with a list of all the works of Aristotle, and from that we get a good idea of what Aristotle wrote, even if it doesn't cover everything. But for Clearchus, we don't have that kind of list, and the only biographical note that actually exists about Clearchus is found in the Suda. That's a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia that includes numerous biographical lemmas, also on Aristotle, for instance. And the Suda is very sparse on what it has to say about Clearchus. It says Clearchus of Soli, he wrote various works. Period. And that's the only thing that the Suda has to say about Clearchus. So
Right.
from that,
That's great.
becomes of course difficult. I.e., what we have to do is reconstruct a list of Clearchus' works from what ancient writers cite from him. And the problem here is that several works are attested only once. So there are undoubtedly many other works of which we know nothing, and which must have existed, but of which there are simply no attestations. Now,
And just to be clear, none of his works survive in full. Everything that we know
exact
of him is in fragments.
exactly, nothing survives. Nothing survives in its original form, and everything survives, or all that we have of Clearchus are so-called fragments. And I say so-called fragments because what a fragment in our or in my discipline, what is traditionally labeled a fragment is a quotation in a later author. So, for instance, if Cicero cites Clearchus, that is called a fragment of Clearchus in Cicero. So we don't have physical fragments, physical scraps or pieces, but what we have is references to views of Clearchus in later authors whose works have been preserved. And we know from those authors we can piece together at least 17 titles. As I said, the fragments they roughly cover the soul with a work on sleep, moral philosophy with works on education, friendship, love, and ways of life. Then the antiquarian research with research on sayings and riddles. Then is biology with works on anatomy and aquatic animals, and finally astronomy. That's what we can piece together based on what ancient authors cite from Clearchus.
Would you say that his most famous work is on the soul, on sleep, on lives? Which one was he arguably most known for?
Well, the Clearchus work that we have the largest number of fragments from, at least, i.e., the work that is cited most often, is his work Peribion. You can translate that as On Lives or On Ways of Life. A work that discussed the right way of life, probably revolving around the Aristotelian classification of the three main ways of life. Aristotle distinguishes three types of life: a politically engaged life, a contemplative life, i.e., a philosophical life behind closed doors, and a life of pleasure, a life of enjoying yourself. And one of the characteristics of Clearchus' moral works, it's one of the works that we actually have quite a bit of material from, or of which we have a fairly good idea of the kind of content that work um, displayed, or the kind of topics that were discussed in that work. And one characteristic of Clearchus' moral works is his love for what we might dub sensational anecdotes of pleasure, decadence, and depravity of individual cities and nations, where the traditional story then goes, where decadence ultimately leads to one's demise. That's a topos that Clearchus apparently really liked or really reprised on numerous occasions, and it's a feature that we find not only in his work Peribio, not only in the work on lives, but also in his work on love, the discussions of love, the erotica, or in the Gergithius, for example, the work on flattery is the same kind of moralizing philosophy or slightly judgmental moralizing work. And to give you just one example of such an anecdote or what the kind of story that you might find in Clearchus, I can give you a fragment on the fate of Dionysius II, who was tyrant of Syracuse. And that Dionysius II, Clearchus says, when he visited Locris, he summoned the local girls and committed disgraceful deeds with him, he says. And as a revenge for this insult, the people of Locris captured, raped, tortured, and killed his wife and children. And Dionysius himself ultimately ended up as a priest of Cybele, and that means he ultimately was castrated. Or, for instance, Clearchus' story of the Lydians. That's a nation also in other authors traditionally known for their luxury and therefore their decadent way of life, and a nation that, according to Clearchus, was so addicted to luxury and it became depraved. They were raping women in any occasion they had, and ultimately what happened to them is that they were ruled by one of the raped women, Omphale, as a punishment for their hubris. So that's a sort of story that you would
Wow.
of which we have a lot.
Yeah.
I've just highlighted just these two to give you an idea of the sort of story that we get from Clearchus, and this the abundance of those anecdotes has led some scholars to conclude that the work on lives, Peribion, was was merely that, a collection of sensational anecdotes without any real philosophy. And
Okay.
the thing to keep in mind here is that the main witness for all these so-called fragments for Clearchus Peribion is Athenaeus Deipnosophists. And Athenaeus Deipnosophists is a work, it's a banquet, where learned people discuss all sorts of topics with a special interest in sensational stories, and they especially like referring to ancient authors to attest certain stories or certain words. And what Athenaeus does is he tends to single out exactly this type of information. If you look at, for instance, Athenaeus' citations of Herodotus, widely considered to be, let's say, at least a relatively serious historian, well, if you would look at what Athenaeus does with Herodotus, you would see that you get the same kind of picture as we have for Clearchus, namely, he selected from Herodotus all the sensational stories, omitting actually the grand narrative in Herodotus, because that's not what he's interested in. He's interested in the juicy stories, and that's exactly what he does with Clearchus as well. There, Athenaeus is not interested in the philosophical point that these anecdotes are supposed to make, and from that we get the impression that this is just a sensationalist collection that has can hardly be considered anything serious. But occasionally we do catch glimpses of the philosophy that lay behind On Lives. We know, for instance, that in On Lives, the Clearchus presented the views of a Pythagorean named Euxithius, potentially a literary character fabricated by Clearchus. But what is interesting is that in that fragment, Euxithius expounds a Platonic theory on the soul, soma sema view. It's called the soul is viewed as being trapped in the body, so that the body becomes a grave or a prison for the soul. And based on that view, the character of Euxithius in Clearchus Peribion argues against suicide. That's why you're not allowed to suicide, or why it's a reprehensible thing to do, is because you basically damage your soul with that. And we know that other authors who wrote works entitled Peribion discussed exactly that kind of topic as well. We know other authors who commented on whether or not suicide is something defensible in those kinds of works. We also know, for instance, that another fragment of Clearchus that probably is derived from the Peribion as well talks about whether or not we should engage in a cynic lifestyle. Cynic lifestyle, the lifestyle of the cynic philosophers. And this again was a topic that other writers in Peripatetic works treated as well. So long story short, Clearchus' work on lives, probably the most important works, at least the work that was perceived to be the most important by later generations, was probably some kind of moralistic literary work on the right way of life, rich with anecdotes. He did still give all those anecdotes, and potentially a dialogue. Apart from that work on lives, I'd say the second most important work is probably his collection of sayings, his Periparoimion, a work in which he discussed the origin of Greek sayings, often with very creative or even very far-fetched interpretations.
And he was also known for a collection of proverbs or sayings as well. Sorry, not
Exactly.
sayings, riddles. Do any of those survive today? Like, do we know what types of riddles he had cataloged, and what was the reason for them? Were they meant to, I'm thinking of koans, like are those the type of riddles that he had in mind, where it was just to get you to think about an answer that has no
Mhm.
answer? And please bear with me, I have absolutely no philosophical background
Mhm,
myself. I
mhm,
never took any in university, but
mhm. Right. So Clearchus' work on riddles, or perigryphon, it's called. The first thing that needs to be highlighted here is that the Greek word gryphos is actually a bit broader than mere riddles, the mere enigmata. And actually, Clearchus explains what he classifies as riddles or classifies as gryphoi, and that a first group of word, a first group of concepts that classify as riddles are word games or drinking games at symposia. For instance, what you would typically get at symposia, at intellectual symposia, supposing that they were not just drinking themselves under the table, they were trying to hold some kind of intellectual conversation. And what you would often get at symposia is these kinds of challenges. You need to be able to essentially testing your wits, and what that entailed, for instance, is you need to recite a verse starting with a certain letter or a certain syllable, or you need to name a certain city starting in a certain letter. And if you're unable to do that, you need to take a shot. Essentially, is what that kind of game was, and that constituted as a
yeah,
griefos as well. Another a second type of griefos is what we would probably classify today as a joke. And one of the to give you an example from Clearchus, he gives the following griefos: a beggar woman was having stomach pains, and when the doctor asked if she had something in her tummy, she said, "How could I? I haven't eaten for 3 days." So
okay, yeah,
that was also a possible griefos. But to give you a real riddle or a true riddle, um, one of the riddles that Clearchus gives us is the following, and it goes more or less as follows: a man that is not a man saw but did not see a bird that is not a bird, which sat but did not sit on a branch that is not a branch, and hit but did not hit with a stone that is not a stone. And here the question becomes: do you know what the riddle is talking about?
yeah.
Could you guess it?
If you're asking me if I can guess it, the answer is a definitive no.
Yeah, and then Clearchus goes on to explain. I'll explain the riddle as well. So, a man that is not a man, i.e., a eunuch, a man that is no longer a man.
Right.
He saw but did not see, i.e., he saw but did not recognize.
Okay.
A bird that is not a bird, i.e., something that flies but is nonetheless not a bird, i.e., he saw a bat. And that bat was sitting but not sitting, i.e., it was not sitting like humans do, but it was perching on a branch that is not a branch. And then he explains, well, it's not a real branch, it's a fennel stalk. And he hit but did not hit. And this is a play on the Greek word for hit. The Greek word here is balo, balein, and balein in Greek can mean both throw and hit. And that's why in Greek he can say he throws and does not throw, i.e., he throws but does not hit. That's the same Greek word. Um, And what did he throw? He threw a stone that is not a stone, i.e., a pumice stone, a
Right.
stone that is technically a stone, but is so different from any other stone that it hardly qualifies as a
Yeah.
stone. And this riddle, by the way, uh, is a riddle that we also I won't say know from, but a riddle that Plato alludes to, for instance, in the Republic, and it's in the one of the commentaries on Plato's Republic that this fragment of Clearchus is taken from, where Clearchus gives us the riddle, how did the riddle run, and what's the solution for the riddle, and the the let's say the goal of this kind of literature, or the Clearchus' goal in this kind of work seems to have been to offer you practical help in being impressive at symposia. So seeing that these kinds of games, these kinds of word games or riddle games are being played at symposia, Clearchus collects them and gives you some hints on what you can use. He gives, for instance, when you're for the game involving recite a line beginning in this syllable. He then gives you a line. Um, a dactylic hexameter, if I'm not mistaken, where he says, "Look, you can. This is a line where you can essentially rearrange all the words. I.e., you can always use this line to as a reply, or you can recycle this line easily by just putting one of the words in front, and it will still be a correct Greek verse.
That's amazing.
That
So this is like a cheat sheet, like the first kind of crib notes of.
it does seem to be, or at least that's the impression that we glean from the citations of from that work. So that seems to have been the purpose of this riddle collection. May have been more of a more pragmatic
Yeah.
collection of things that you might use yourself if you struggle at a symposia to impress your friends or to impress the host. That's the work on riddles, and the other work on proverbs. Maybe you would like some few Greek proverbs as well while I'm
Yeah, for sure.
reciting a few things. One of the few some of the proverbs that Clearchus offers us, for instance, is the beginning is half of everything, i.e., it's important to make a good start. To have the mind of an octopus, i.e., to have a mind that is able to adapt just like the octopus is able to camouflage itself by resembling the rock that lies next to it. The famous saying, know yourself, probably a saying that most people or many people would know nowadays. One of the Delphic sayings given by the Delphic oracle, according to Clearchus, to Hylon, one of the seven sages. Another nice proverb, perfume on lentils. That is essentially the equivalent of lipstick on a pig.
Right.
um, then we get, for instance, friends' belongings are in common. That's also a nice one. And then finally, for instance, acting like Akko, i.e., acting like a proverbial stupid person, because Akko, and then Clearchus goes on to explain where does this even come from? And Akko was a woman, apparently, who talked to her own reflection in the mirror, so who was so stupid that she could not realize that it was herself she was talking to.
And now these are um, he recorded them, right? I mean, he's not actually coming up with some of
No,
these
no, no.
riddles himself.
Yeah, so these were essentially proverbs that some of which we find in Plato as well, so or in ancient Greek poets that that predate Clearchus by centuries. So what Clearchus does, he doesn't come up with these proverbs himself, but he collects them and then tries to explain where they come from. So it tries to come up with a story of how was this proverb created? Where does it come from? Who was the first person to speak it? Is also one of the questions. I just said the know yourself. One of the big debates in antiquity is who said know yourself, gnotise auton, who was the first to say that, and Clearchus has his opinion on that, and he expounds that opinion or
Mhm.
expounded that opinion in that work Peripatetic.
So for me, one of the things that I found, and For the record, thank you so much for shining some light on some of his works, because this is not something that's easily accessible. Like, you can't really find this information out there, and it's really interesting to know what he was known for, and what sort of writing he what sort of works he's published. What really kind of drew me to Clearchus, though, is and you mentioned the Seven Sages and other famous inscriptions that are related to the Delphic Oracle. Um, we have evidence that Clearchus actually traveled, and he traveled as far as Ai-Khanoum, which
Hmm.
is a city in modern day Afghanistan, a Greek city in modern day Afghanistan. Well, it's not a modern Greek city, but it
No.
was one that may have been founded
Uh-huh.
by Alexander the Great. Do you mind just telling me a little bit about Ai-Khanoum? What is it known for? What do we know about it? And this really, really famous inscription, which is associated with Clearchus and is sort of the evidence that we have that he traveled eastwards. Yeah, go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah, so Ai-Khanoum, that's the modern name of the site in Afghanistan where that Greek settlement was discovered. It was discovered in 1965, part of the ancient Greco-Bactrian kingdom. It's often identified as the ancient city Alexandria at the Oxus. The site was excavated from 1965 to 1978 by a French team of archaeologists, the Délégation archéologique française en Afghanistan. Uh, a delegation that was already created almost 50 years before that in 1922 at the initiative of the then Emir Amullah Khan. But it was only until, or it was not before 1965 that any real major discoveries were made. And what they found in Ai-Khanoum were several buildings that were excavated, such as a gymnasium, a palace, a theater, a sanctuary, mausoleum, so very Greek buildings. And um, what one of the key discoveries that was made there was a sanctuary where an inscription was found, and that is the so-called inscription of Ai-Khanoum, where Clearchus is attested. And one of the key problems of that inscription is when it should be dated. The dating is the key problem that scholars disagree about. And in essentially the arguments that archaeologists, for instance, tend to use when trying to date Ai-Khanoum, or in trying to date individual buildings or individual inscriptions found in Ai-Khanoum, they tend to use pottery to draw up a relative chronology for Ai-Khanoum, distinguishing several ceramic phases and then just comparing that to the pottery that you can find in the Aigais. But it remains difficult to assign absolute dates to that relative chronology. And the stone with the inscription that we're talking about was found in a funerary monument of a certain Kineas, who was probably the founder of the city. And what the inscription contains is a list of sayings related to the stages of life. That's found on the right part of the stone. We get well, just give you the sayings. As a child, be well behaved. In puberty, be self-restrained. In middle age, be righteous. As an old man, be well advised. And upon death, be without sorrow. And what is interesting is that these are the very maxims that were actually inscribed on the columns of the temple for Apollo in Delphi. The sayings, these five sayings that I've just listed, are actually the sayings that close the list of that close that Delphic list. They're found at the end of the list, and this stone with the inscription um, served as the basis for a column on which the other Delphic maxims were written. And indeed, the French, not me, but the archaeologists indeed found a very small fragment of the column with two additional Delphic sayings. So we know that we have an inscription here that copies the Delphic sayings from the original in Delphi, and that is confirmed further by the epigram, the poem that accompanies it on the left part of the inscriptions. On the right part, we have the last couple of sayings from Delphi, and then the left on the left part then explains or gives an additional explanation of what we're looking at here. And the epigram goes as follows: "These wise words of men of old are set up in most holy Pytho that is in Delphi, as sayings of famous men. There Clearchus," and here's his name, "Clearchus wrote them down meticulously and dedicated them in the shrine of Cineas to shine from afar." And that's why we know that this is the shrine for Cineas, because the epigram tells us that it's that it's his his shrine. So a man named Clearchus, according to the epigram, copied the maxims that were written on the columns in Delphi, containing, among others, Gnotis auton, and had them inscribed here on the monument for the deceased Cineas. And here the essentially the debate starts, because one of the major questions is, well, when was this monument constructed, and more particularly, when was his inscription incorporated into the monument? We know that there are various stages of the monument. We know that the monument was restructured a couple of times, and we know that when the inscription itself was found, that it was actually turned with the inscribed face towards the wall. So we know that when the inscription was found, it was actually had already been repurposed, i.e. the column that originally was there that accompanied it, i.e. with the sayings that the epigram explains, no longer existed in the last stage of that monument. So we know that the inscription and the accompanying sayings of Delphi that were on the column belong to the earliest stages of the monument. And then the next question is, yeah, but what is the oldest stage? What kind of absolute date do you want to assign to that? And here opinions have widely diverged. Some scholars go as far as to claim that the inscription dates to the time of Antioch III. Antioch III, that's 212, 205 BC, i.e. far too late for Clearchus. Remember, Clearchus was a pupil of Aristotle, and if we know that Aristotle taught in Athens from 335 to 322 BC, Clearchus must have been born no later than 340, i.e., he must have been at least 20 years old to attend the first lecture of Aristotle, and he probably is even older than that. He probably should be his birth should probably be dated even earlier than that. But that's, let's say, the maximum as far as we can move his date of birth. And of course, if he is born in 340, it's highly unlikely that in 205 he's still around, that he's still around to do this. But other scholars have proposed other interpretations for the chronology. Others have claimed, for instance, that it's not Antioch III, it's Antioch I, i.e. 280 to 260 BC, more or less, which comes a bit closer to our Clearchus. But the truth of the matter is that the archaeological evidence, or that's at least my stance on this, is that the archaeological evidence is insufficient to assign absolute dates, i.e. to rule out that Clearchus, or to prove that the inscription is too recent to have been written by Clearchus. And there are in fact indications that there was at least a Greek settlement in whatever form that predates Antioch, both Antioch I and Antioch III. We have pre-Seleucid coins. We have coins issued under Seleucus, the direct general of Alexander the Great. So we know that that at some point Alexander's army, or at the very least Seleucus' army, passed by Ai-Khanoum and probably stayed here for a while. And knowing that the monument for Cineas is the oldest monument that we know of in Ai-Khanoum, makes it very likely that the inscription should not be dated as late as some people have claimed. And there is actually an argument in favor of an even older date, and that is the hand in which the inscription is made. The inscription of the epigram is actually a bit different from the way the sayings themselves are written, because it imitates the way literary texts were written. It imitates a book hand, and there's one particular feature that that this epigram shows, and that is the so-called four-barred sigma. Four-barred sigma is a sigma as you know it today, with the four lines. But the regular sigma throughout most of antiquity was a lunate sigma, the sigma that is essentially like a modern C.
Hmm.
And we know that in papyri that four-barred sigma disappears in the early 3rd century. So the way in which the epigram is written, the paleography of that is a very strong argument to at least um, show that this is probably among oldest finds in Ai-Khanoum, and probably late 4th, early 3rd century, which is at least compatible with the dates of Clearchus.
And then, if I'm not mistaken, there's other arguments that would also suggest that it was Clearchus who commissioned that inscription. The fact that it reflects Clearchus's interests in the Seven Sages, and it also reflects his interest in "quote unquote" barbarians.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So what speaks in favor of Clearchus, of the Clearchus of the inscription of Ai-Khanoum being Clearchus of Soli, is that first, as you said, it reflects his interest in sayings. We already talked about his work on sayings, in which we know that, or in which in all likelihood, Clearchus discussed the Delphic maxim "Know yourself." So he was interested in these Delphic maxims. We know that the epigram in Ai-Khanoum states this Clearchus copied the maxims in Delphi and then went to Ai-Khanoum to copy them here. And from other fragments, we know that Clearchus of Soli, so Clearchus of Peripatetic, we know that he visited Delphi because he describes how he saw the stone on which the goddess Leto jumped when trying to evade the python snake in Delphi. So we have numerous fragments of Clearchus where he shows his interest in the lore of Delphi. And apart from that, we also have Clearchus' interest in barbarians, or to translate it perhaps a bit more, a bit less provocatively, non-Greek cultures. The Greek word barbaros can be translated as barbarian, but essentially means just anything non-Greek. Includes, in the case of Clearchus, the Persians, the Indians, and the Jews. We know that Clearchus was interested in these cultures. We know some fragments comment on these non-Greek nations. So it certainly would be compatible with a journey into the East, a journey accompanying, in all likelihood, one of the Hellenistic monarchs in the East, and probably being part of maybe even just the foundation of the city. Because keep in mind these Delphic maxims. That's what we're doing here is Alexander the Great essentially invaded the East and tries to establish Greek culture there. And it's hard. You can hardly get as more Greek as the Greek oracle of Delphi, whose wisdom you're portraying here and whose wisdom you're propagating here as well. We should probably see this monument for Kineas and the accompanying Delphic maxims as sort of propaganda in favor of Greek culture, or trying to establish Greek culture in the East. The final argument, or the final detail that's interesting to point out for Ai-Khanoum, is that there's actually been a papyrus found in Ai-Khanoum that preserves a philosophical dialogue on Plato's theory of forms, which seems to have been written either by Aristotle or by one of his pupils. So what we find in Ai-Khanoum is the presence, at least, of intellectuals at some point that were interested in rather technical Aristotelian philosophy, because the dialogue itself that was found there, the papyrus fragment, is a relatively technical discussion of Plato's theories of forms, not terribly accessible to the non-initiated. So we get at least the presence of people interested in the kind of philosophy that Clearchus practiced as well.
If I'm to understand this correctly, we're making the argument that Clearchus was invited to Ai-Khanoum specifically to help in making a Hellenistic city out in Bactria.
Yep. That is the hypothesis at the very least. Admittedly, there is no ancient source that tells us that it's the case. That is the interpretation that is a valid one, because the inscription doesn't mention that. But this hypothesis is essentially extrapolating what we know for other philosophers. We know that other Hellenistic literary men joined such expeditions or went on such diplomatic missions. We know, for instance, that Clearchus, fellow student in the Peripatus, Callisthenes, was essentially Alexander the Great's court historian and went along on Alexander's campaign. He didn't survive that campaign either. By the way, he was at one point executed by Alexander the Great. He was a very angry man. He could lash out at people. But we know of intellectuals that are invited to the courts of these monarchs even before the time of Alexander the Great. Already his father, Philip of Macedonia, attracted intellectuals. Aristotle, among others. He was Alexander the Great's, let's say, primary school teacher or high
Tutor?
school tutor. Yeah, essentially, he taught him Homer, essentially. So we know that these monarchs tended to attract intellectuals, philosophers particularly, and we know that oftentimes these philosophers would join these expeditions as the intellectuals.
You're gonna have to correct me here. I feel like there's with the dates, because one of Alexander the Great's generals was Stasinor, who was a native of Soli in Cyprus, and I believe he was given a satrapy out in Bactria or somewhere along those lines. Do Clearchus and Stasinor, do their timelines overlap? Is there any possibility that, I mean, they're both also from Soli, not only from Cyprus but from the exact same city? Is there any possibility that they would have known each other, and he himself may have invited? I know this is a lot of conjecture and guesswork here, but yeah, did those timelines overlap?
Well, at the very least, based on what we know of Clearchus's dates, which is admittedly not a whole lot, but we have some indications. We know that he attended Aristotle's lectures. We know that he mentions Alexander the Great, so we know that he's still very much alive when Alexander the Great, and probably even still alive when Alexander the Great has already passed away. So in terms of timelines, it's certainly possible. I think it was a scholar, Tzitzirides, that suggested that possibility of Stasanor for the first time. There's no ancient source that confirms that or attests that, but it's not a bad guess in my opinion, because it is still a general of Alexander the Great. The main question is, it mostly hinges on when did Clearchus, if he is indeed the Clearchus, the Peripatetic Clearchus, when he exactly went to Ai-Khanoum. And that's unfortunately a question that is almost impossible to answer with certainty. I think the evidence allows for some wiggle room. It allows you to at least have a spectrum or time frame that would be compatible with Stasinor. But if he joined, for instance, I don't know, Seleucus, the other general of Alexander, that would be less compatible. But it admittedly is a bit conjecture trying to connect the two men.
Right.
If you want, I can give you as a sort of closing, as a sort of close to the episode, one text that I found particularly interesting of Clearchus to close the story
Yeah,
of
definitely. Please do.
Clearchus, maybe even interesting for the philosophers listening. And I think one of the intriguing fragments of Clearchus is the lost work on sleep. And in that fragment, I'll paraphrase a bit what the fragment says. Clearchus portrays Aristotle as talking about a Jewish sage he once met, a Jewish wise man. Clearchus has Aristotle claim that the Jews descend from the Indian Brahmins, that there's your non-Greek people or your interesting barbarians. He cites the name of their city as Hierusalemen, which is a lot closer to the original Hebrew than the standard Greco-Latin Hierosolyma, as it's normally transliterated. And in
Okay.
that work on sleep, Clearchus argues that it's possible for the soul to leave the body. And the Jewish man that Aristotle supposedly met was able to draw out the soul of a young man with a rod. And in addition to that, Clearchus tells us a nice story. He tells us of a story when a man named Cleonymus of Athens passed out and was believed to be dead. They were preparing the burial for him. And when his mother embraced him to bid her final farewell, she noticed a slight trace of breathing in him. So they stopped the burial. Cleonymus was ultimately revived and then recounted all that he had experienced when his soul was separated from his body. And what he then describes is his soul had risen to the sky, had arrived in a fabulous land sacred to the goddess Hestia, and there he met another Greek man named Lysis of Syracuse. And these men, they were having such a good time that they urged each other to seek out one another if ever they were able to return to their bodies and find each other again. And not much later, Lysias, whose soul had returned to his body as well, he comes to Athens, and when Cleonymus saw him, he immediately recognizes him, though he had never before seen him on earth. He had only seen his soul, but he recognizes him, cries out his Lysias' name, and from that point onwards, they decide to live together until they die. That's the story that I think is one of the more intriguing ones that we find in among the fragments of Clearchus.
Yeah, that is as a nice little touch to it. Very um, heartwarming in a sense. You mentioned Jerusalem. Are we inferring like that's like the one and only Jerusalem, correct?
Oh yeah, yeah, that's the one and only Jerusalem. Because what he says in the fragment is he talks about the Jews, the Judaioi, and he says, well, the Judaioi they are derived from the Indian sages, sort of the typical discussion of who came first. And according to Clearchus' presentation, it's the Jews are derived from the Brahmins, and they have a sacred city, and their sacred city is Jerusalem. The
Hmm.
only sacred city that it could have been, Jerusalem, was also known at the time. It was not a secret city. But what is interesting is that Clearchus here gives us a transliteration of the name that seems to imply that he talked to a maybe a Greek Jew, or at least someone who seems to know the Hebrew and who gives him the real name of the city, or at least the slightly more accurate name of the city, whereas most other Greek and Latin authors always use Hierosolyma as the official Greco-Latin name of that city.
If you had access to one of his lost works, if you could read in full, would it be this one, or was there another one that comes to mind?
I think the most interesting works um, to to have had by Clearchus would be either this one, the one on the soul, or the one on sleep, where he discusses the soul, or his work on lives. Even though we have a relatively large number of fragments, his work on lives, that's maybe a final detail that's worth mentioning. All the other works that we have of Clearchus, or all the other works that we know that Clearchus wrote, we know that they were written in one or two books, and we know that the work Peribion comprised at least 8 books. So we know that this was a very long work, a very substantial work. So it would have certainly been interesting to have that, to have the original. Athenaeus was extremely interested in it, even if he savaged or he brutalized the original by only drawing out the sensational stuff. But it
Yeah.
would have been a nice work to read.
Hertian, uh, I presume you lecture, obviously, in the different universities. I want to say you're a very compelling speaker. I really enjoyed
Thank you,
listening to you.
thank you very much.
It was really
I
fun.
enjoyed attending the podcast, and I enjoyed talking about Clearchus, a man who, as you said at the beginning, who not a lot of people know, and who, in my opinion, does have a few interesting fragments to let's say divulge to a wider audience or to.
Absolutely. But you know what, Gertjan, this was like really fun. I really enjoyed this recording this episode. Uh, I mean, Clearchus, you know, we don't know much about him, obviously, but some of the stuff that he's written is really fascinating stuff. I mean, I wish we could know a little bit more about his philosophical interpretations on life and on sleep and on all these wild different topics, and to know that he very likely may have traveled eastwards and
Mhm.
was an essential cog, and he's a very fascinating figure, and to have spent some time talking about him with you, you know, thank you so much. This was great.
Mhm.
I really enjoyed this episode.
I was very happy to do that. Very happy to partake in this little history of Cyprus, and I hope that that the audience has gained something from Clearchus.
Oh, definitely, and a very interesting little bit too. Really enjoyed it. Again, have a great night, Herkjan, and we'll all be in touch.
We'll be in touch.
Okay,
Awesome.
take care.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.